Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by CityCURRENT and powered by Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services.
This show shares personal stories and insight from those who are leading by example, fueling positive change and making a difference so we can learn and do the same.
We cover life lessons, business advice, passion, and purpose.
Now here's your host, Jeremy Park.
Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services is proud to power the ChangeMakers podcast. We're a people-first company that protects what matters most, the families, businesses, and trailblazers that keep our community going. As one of the nation's top independent insurance firms, Higginbotham is a single-source solution for business insurance, employee benefits, HR services, and personal insurance that's customized for you. We're here to serve you, the people you care about, and your community. Call 866-377-1959 or visit higginbotham.com.
Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by CityCURRENT and powered by Higginbotham. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. On this episode, we're talking with an individual focused on helping survivors of domestic and sexual violence. We're here with the executive director of the Cocoon, Kathy Mull. Kathy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you are a change maker, and we're going to be diving into some very important topics centered around domestic and sexual violence, talking about helping survivors, but also, too, talking about a very innovative program, Champions of Change, where you're stepping into the workplace and helping employees. And so we have a lot to dive into, but let's start by getting to know you personally. Give us some of your background, where you grew up, talk about your childhood and some lessons learned. So give us some background on where you grew up.
So I'm actually from a small town in Ohio. So most folks are probably familiar with Cleveland, which would kind of be the big city. That I was we're probably about 45 minutes from Cleveland. So it's a very small town called Wadsworth. And it was really kind of your traditional small town that I grew up in. Everybody knew everybody, right? We all knew everybody's business that was, happening in the small town. And so there were a lot of great things about growing up in a town like that, right? Like you learn the lessons of, the importance of taking care of each other, right? The importance of, sort of neighborly love, right? For like a lack of a better term. And so, really growing up in that sort of small knit community. I think that the other thing that you learn from growing up in a small knit community is you learn all of the other things that go on in people's homes that aren't always necessarily the best, right? I think we all like to think, that everybody is in a space where they have enough food to eat, they have a roof over their head, they're safe at home, they're all of those things. And thankfully, for a lot of us, that's the case. But I think, you also learn that isn't the case for everybody. And so, there was really, growing up in that environment, really helped to shape sort of those values of, how can we continue to create communities that care about one another and take care of each other.
Talk about any siblings, talk about your parents and their career paths.
Sure. Yeah. So I have a younger sister. So it was just the two of us growing up. She took a totally different path. So I'm a social worker by background. So I really kind of, I think, embodied those ideas of, wanting to support and help other people. She does marketing, which is a very important thing to do. But I tell her all the time, I do not understand your world, right? Like, and it's interesting because, as becoming a director of an agency, I've had to kind of dabble in all of those kinds of things. And so I've become to appreciate the importance of what marketers do. But I'm like, oh, you live kind of in an island all on your own. Like, I don't really understand too much of that. So it was just the two. I mean, sibling wise, it was just the two of us growing up. My mom was an incredible stay-at-home mom. She originally had a degree in psychology. And so I think that's probably where I get my drive from. But then I think she had some kids and she was like, you know what, this is what was meant for me. And she's spot on. She was like the best stay-at-home mom that you could have. So I think that she found the right career path for her. And then kind of interestingly, my father is a businessman. So he worked for a lot of different companies and corporations and was sales and, engineering and all of those kinds of things. So it's almost like we were kind of like two separate, groups of people that came together as one as a family, but it works for us. So it's a great. I feel very fortunate that I grew up in a home, that had the kind of support and care that I know sometimes the families that we see don't have the same thing. So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting too when you look at just the commonalities, you and your mother, and then your sister and your father, right?
Mhm.
Like, so from a business and marketing and sales kind of relationship side, and then a different type of relationship in terms of community between you and your mom. So did that play out at all? Or is that just kind of like, just an outside looking in, like, oh, that's kind of a nice little tie-in?
Yeah, it did a little bit. Like it was because you can tell kind of how we just sort of drew to each other, right? Do you know what I mean? And it would make for interesting like conversations, and even now, like as adults, right? It makes for some pretty interesting conversation. I will share, and it's interesting that you bring this up because I think I never like you always put the dots together, but when we think about sort of the tie into some of the things we're going to talk about later. My father being a very successful businessman in the corporate world, for a long time really struggled to understand the work that social workers do. Right. Like, and so, it's like, oh, you just like hold hands with people, or you just, you know what I mean? I'm like, oh, is there so much more to that? But I think it was really hard for him. It's just as much as I talked about, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around what my sister does as a marketer, because I'm like, how did you see that? I never would have seen that vision, or I never would have put those words together, or, I think similar to him, you know what I mean? It was kind of like, I don't really get what you do. Like, I understand the importance again of like taking care of people and wanting to, but like as a profession, like that it was hard for him to wrap his head around the significance of that.
Well, it's interesting, and this is a larger conversation, but it's amazing when you talk about just the nonprofit world in and of itself. There's so many who have no clue, really, like, the value, how it works, the operational, like that you are running a business really in terms of social good and impact. And, there's a lot of just misperceptions, misconceptions, like whatever you want to say around just the nonprofit world in general. I think that business leaders especially are starting to better understand, but still there's just a lot that I think needs to be better explained in terms of all the amazing things that nonprofits do and how you operate, and which that's a whole nother conversation, but yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So talk about maybe one, like when you look back on your childhood, one favorite tradition, something that stands out to you that brings a smile to your face. And that can be, around a holiday or something special that you all, would traditionally do.
There's several of them that I can think of, but I think, we were always really intentional about having one sort of planned family trip that was just the four of us, right? And it was different. Sometimes we would do larger trips, but sometimes they would be just smaller things, day trips or, like weekend trips, right? Like those things that you can do. And so, we always knew, and particularly those things would happen in the summertime, when we weren't in school and all of that kind of stuff. But, we always knew that there was going to be that opportunity to go explore someplace that we hadn't been, learn something new, see something new. My parents were always really good about like taking us to different places. And so that has always kind of stuck with me so much to that is a tradition we've carried on with my son, is that, like we try to do the same thing. And so that's always held a special place in my heart.
Is there any sort of, common saying that your parents would say, things that you're like, back then as a child, you're like, oh, here we go again. It's mom and dad, saying this or giving me this quote or, lecture. And then all of a sudden now you find yourself like, oh, wow, I'm either saying the same things or I'm now, thinking the same way.
Yeah, it's funny because I think we all say this, like, oh, I'm never going to do that when I have kids. Right. And then you have kids and then you find yourself doing some of those same things. So, yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I would pinpoint like one thing when you say that. Like, I don't know that there's one thing that comes to mind. But I do think one of the things that I have learned and that I know that I didn't appreciate, and I think it's the same thing for most of us, is like how much my parents knew and instilled in me that I didn't get. Right at the time, that I was like, I don't understand why this is important, or I don't understand why I need to know that, or I don't understand why I need to do this. Right. Like, Even just like the small ways that we would give back in the community and we would volunteer, right? Like that was just like, but now when I look at that now, I'm like, okay, there was a reason why. Do you know what I mean? Our parents are smarter than we think they are, and when we're younger. And so I think what was more of that, of just kind of the way that the way the expectations were set for us, and we knew that seemed just sort of normal to us, and maybe wasn't the same things that happens for everybody, right?
Let's start steering our way to the Cocoon. So you mentioned obviously the early influences, but where did the idea of going in professionally to social work start to appear? Was that something that was formed in like grade school? Was that something more like in college? Start talking about kind of that path forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of social work didn't really happen until I was a couple years into college. But really the idea had been there since I was a teenager. So, the more that I was aware of what was happening, mostly with my peers, when I was in high school. And again, I kind of talked about, living in a small town where we sort of knew a lot about each other. I recognized and realized that there were a lot of people that I knew that were experiencing either abusive relationships or unhealthy relationships. But we didn't, I mean, that was 20 something, 25, almost, oh my gosh, at this point, probably almost 30 years ago. Oh, don't talk about how old I am. But it wasn't a household conversation. It wasn't talked about. I don't remember sitting in a classroom and we talked about healthy and unhealthy relationships and domestic violence and all of those kinds of things. And so I knew then that there had to be a better way. Like there had to be a way to create spaces where people could talk about what they were experiencing. And there had to be a better way to get people help. But that was, I was, again, it was a teenager and I didn't really know what to do with that thought, but it was there. And so fast forward, I went to college and decided that I was going to be an education major. And so I started my path being an education major, and I was like, okay, this isn't really for me. I really want to work with survivors of violence, but there's no degree in survivors of violence, right? Like you don't sign up and say, okay, this is what I want to do, right? So I started asking around, and I kept getting pointed to social work. Like everybody kept saying, you need to be a social worker. And I kept saying, I don't want to be a social worker because the only vision that I had of being a social worker was children's services. And so I was like, I don't want to go and take kids from their homes. That's not what I want to do, right? And so it took a while for people to really enlighten me that social work is so much more than that. And so, as I was able to learn more about what social workers truly do, and their place in the world, and all of the plethora of different things that I could do as a social worker, including working with survivors of violence, I was like, all right, this is it. This is my space and my thing.
How do you define social work then? So when you talk about the definition of a social worker, here's your chance. How would you define a social worker?
Yeah, a social worker to me is really somebody who is there to walk alongside individuals in their time of need, and be the one to open doors and to provide support in a safe space. And so that can look different, for everybody in every space. But to me, that's really truly what it is that, a lot of times as an individual, I might be having a problem that I'm trying to solve. I might have a crisis in my home. It could be a medical crisis. It could be, a financial crisis. It could be violence, which is what we work at through the Cocoon. There's so many things that could be happening to us, and we don't always even just know where to turn, right? Like, and so, a social worker's role is really to be that person who can open the doors and provide support and create community, for people as they navigate through sometimes what can be the toughest times of their lives.
We'll definitely switch over and talk about the Cocoon right after this, but touch on, you mentioned obviously there's not a degree to go down this path, but when you talk about specialized training for you and your team, and where I'm going with this is, you are one of a very small number of individuals to complete the Advocacy Learning Center course through Praxis International. And so when you talk about really specializing and going in at a much deeper level, obviously that's what you and your team have done. So talk about the training and the expertise that goes into this, and then we'll switch over and talk about the Cocoon.
Yeah, absolutely. Our field as a whole is driven by best practices that actually come out of Praxis International, which is in Minnesota. And so are kind of what we consider to be the founders of the current way that we support survivors of domestic and sexual violence come out of that program. And so that is where I am a product of one of their training courses. So what you mentioned is that there's a very small, like you said, a little over 250 of us ever who graduated from that program that then allows us to take all of that best practice and research and knowledge that we've learned in supporting survivors over the years and drill that down into our local organizations. That being said, we are really intentional about training all advocates, which is what we call individuals who work with survivors in a very intensive training process that we before we give them the opportunity to actually work and support survivors in the community, because what we know is that the assistance that they need, one is very specialized, and two, where our whole goal is to mitigate safety risks, and so we need to know what we're doing, for lack of a better term, right, before we then try to support somebody and don't want to do anything that's going to put them in more harm's way. So all of our staff go through a 55-hour training process before they even start their advocacy journey with us, which really tries to take all of those things and wrap it up and give them the best tools that we can to ultimately give survivors the best opportunities to find safety and healing.
So go ahead and dive into the Cocoon, because on your end, you've been with the Cocoon for a long time, and you started as program director and then obviously now executive director, and you've been in that role for a long time as well. And so talk about the Cocoon and talk about stepping into the Cocoon.
Yeah, absolutely. So really exciting for us. We'll be celebrating 20 years this year of providing services to, so we're located in Wood County, Ohio. If anybody knows Bowling Green State University, they're right in our backyard, actually right behind me. And so we've been here going on 20 years of providing support and services to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. When you talk about small town, it's kind of interesting. I went from one small town to another small town. When we talk about the demographics or the dynamics of Wood County, we're very rural. We are actually the largest county in the state of Ohio square footage wise, but we're not very densely populated. So we're pretty spread out. We're pretty rural. And we have very much a small town feel, a lot of farming community, all of those kinds of things. And so prior to us opening the doors, there was really no resources here for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. There were a couple of hotlines and some services and those kinds of things. And so we really, there was a group of folks that really felt like it was important to do better for survivors in our community. And then unfortunately, now we're probably going on about 21, 22 years ago, we had 4 domestic violence homicides that occurred right back to back. And so you can imagine how that rocks a small community. And it kind of took away this doesn't happen here, or, we don't need these kinds of resources here. And so, as tragic, and we can never take away the tragedy or the loss or the heartache for the families that lost a loved one, that also was finally the door open to say, okay, we hear you. We need to do better for people in our community. And so we opened up an emergency shelter 20 years ago, and we've grown incredibly, in my opinion, since then, to really continue to, hear survivors' needs, break down the barriers for survivors in accessing services, but also breaking down all the barriers that survivors find in getting safety and healing for themselves and their families. And so we've really continued to expand and grow the services that we provide in the community since then.
Talk about how pervasive domestic and sexual violence is, and you can take that from a national lens or more of a local lens, but talk about how pervasive it is. And when you look at, something that impacts all races, religions, socioeconomic levels, the fact that this really permeates, and is so pervasive across the community and across all different sides of our community, it's very alarming. So talk about, kind of that side of it and where we are in this place. So obviously with the pandemic and what happened there, are the trends better, worse? Go ahead and kind of put your pulse on it.
Yeah. So, the short answer to your question is everybody knows a survivor of domestic violence. And so, either we are aware of them, like if we took a moment and we stopped and we thought about who are the people that I know, the people that are closest to me, and even, going on a little farther than that, or we are not aware of somebody who's experiencing it, but there is somebody in our circles that is unfortunately either has or is currently experiencing domestic violence. So what we know is, and these are reported numbers, we know that 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 7 men will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. So again, think about how many people you know, and you can do the math, right? The unfortunate thing is that we also know that survivors gaining the courage to report and share what they're experiencing is really difficult. And so that 1 in 4 number is just people that have reported that they're experiencing it. So we know that the number is much larger than that. Unfortunately, what we also know is that every 9 seconds in our country, a victim of domestic violence is experiencing physical abuse. So again, I mean, how many 9 seconds, right, have we been sitting here having this conversation? So all of that to say that the numbers, unfortunately, are very large and very, I think, staggering for a lot of us to think about the pervasiveness of domestic violence in our communities. In our little local county, right? So talking again about, how small we are. I mean, we serve an average of 850 to 900 survivors a year. And that's just right here locally. And so, in places that are larger than us, clearly programs are going to see much larger requests for service or people who are reaching out for assistance. And so, our goal is always to make sure that everybody gets access to the services that they need when they need them, but also to really be working to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. So that ultimately our goal is that, it's sort of this double-sided coin, right? Like we want to see our numbers in a way that reflects people needing help and getting access and hopefully finding safety. But also if our numbers are going down because the number of incidents of violence are going down, that's a win too, right? And so, trying to work through that. What we have seen to talk a little bit about, what things have been like for us over the last several years, COVID really brought on an increased level of violence in our communities. And, unfortunately, that's not uncommon. I mean, anytime a country, a, geographic area, group of people experiences some kind of major disaster, we see violence rates go up in general. What the pandemic did very specifically for survivors of domestic violence is that we all said, isolate, right? And not saying that wasn't the right thing to do. At the time, that was, the way we thought we could mitigate the spread of the COVID virus through our communities. But what we found is that then put survivors who are already isolated and marginalized and in dangerous situations in increased danger in a couple of ways. One, because they had less access to resources outside of their home. So if they were going out occasionally to go to the grocery store or to do other things, they might be able to access some of those supports, in a way that they couldn't when they were stuck in their homes. We also know abusers weren't going to work. And so the relief that I might have got when my abuser left the house for a little while, I was no longer getting that relief because they were probably working from home or they were laid off, right? I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people lost employment during the kind of the height of the pandemic. And what we also saw is that, abusers felt less need to hide what they were doing because there were less eyes on what was happening. So, the hope would be is that, if I ended up with a black eye or a bruise or something, and then I went to work or I went to, someplace where people knew me, they would start asking questions, right? Well, nobody was looking because I was, we were all, kind of in our own spaces. And so we saw this heightened level of violence occurring for survivors. We saw it harder for them to access services. Not only did we see it in the domestic violence space, but we saw it in the child abuse space. I mean, if you look at any organizations that serve children that are being abused, the numbers went down. The reported numbers went down during COVID. It wasn't because there was less child abuse, but kids weren't going to school, right? There was less of this opportunity for children to share what was happening for them. And so our calls specifically in 2020 went up in 1 month, 40% in people reaching out and asking for help. And so thankfully, where we are today, we've seen some of those numbers come down. I think we're seeing a little bit of the level of violence coming down. But what we are finding is that the healing process is more intensive and is longer for survivors than it was kind of pre-2020. And so that right now, where we're sitting right now, is sort of this more intensive support that we're finding that survivors need, both emotionally, physically, and financially, to try to get back on their feet.
Let's talk about one of the programs, because I think what's interesting is when you talk about, okay, how do we help? How do we help the community? How do we get people out and really better understand, one, that the Cocoon is a resource, but two is like, how do we get on the front end of this to prevent domestic and sexual violence? When you look at the workplace, it's a really powerful opportunity to go in because employees, typically companies, you deal with the professional development, but the personal side of what people are dealing with. And so I love the fact that you've now figured out a way to partner with companies to bring workshops and resources and information into the workplace to really help create safe workplaces, but create those relationships that can carry out into the homes to prevent sexual and domestic violence. And so talk about that, because you and I originally met through University of Toledo, the Doing Right Spotlight. It's a big event tied to an initiative that you will talk all about with Principal Business Enterprises. But talk about Champions of Change. Talk about the work of stepping in and working with companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big shout out. So I'm a University of Toledo alumni, so I have to give my shout out to them because I'm excited that they are doing that program and spotlighting the good that's happening in our community. So I had to get that in there real quick. So yeah, our Champions of Change program is really it's one of our newest what we call innovative programs, and it really is about partnering with the community to help us support survivors that are in our community. I mean, one of the things that we talk about is really continuing to expand the safety net for survivors in the community, but also being part of the solution, because that's a big piece of the work that we do, is that, we continue to provide, timely services for survivors as they are either experiencing violence or really in the aftermath of violence. But ultimately, the conversation needs to be around how do we prevent it from occurring in the first place? And at Cocoon, we cannot do that alone. I mean, the only way that we can really truly create safe communities is with the support of the community around us. And the Champions of Change program is really a product of that. And how do we all come together for the greater good of the community and say, you know what, we're here for survivors, and we're going to create this opportunity for survivors to find safety. And we're also going to send a message in our community that we don't tolerate domestic and sexual violence happening here. And that's truly what the Champions of Change program is designed to do. So we developed after recognizing that employers needed a space to have these conversations and to support their employees. And what we also know is that survivors, one, as I was talking about earlier, need a safe place to go to get help and resources, because Cocoon's hotline number is not usually the first place that people call. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is not usually the first place that people call. They tell somebody they know. They tell a friend, a family member, a coworker, somebody to say, this is happening and I don't know what to do. And then we're reliant on those folks to then say, I'm so glad you told me. Let me get you connected with somebody who can probably help you understand your options and talk about where we go from here. And so we know that employers are intended to be safe places for survivors. What we also know is that survivors are losing their jobs at alarming rates because of what they're experiencing at home. Because either they are not able to effectively carry out their responsibilities in the workplace because they're worried about what's going on at home, the effects of what's going on at home, or an abuser is bringing their chaos and their abuse to the workplace, and an employer is like, thank you, but no thank you. I've got a business to run. I can't manage that and effectively do what I need to do to keep my business running smoothly. So the Champions of Change programs allows businesses the opportunity to partner with the Cocoon to say, we see this, we hear you, we want to be the best support that we can be, and how can we collectively come together and provide that opportunity. And so what we bring to the table is having a conversation around what does domestic and sexual violence look like? How could it potentially be impacting your employees? What are some of the behaviors and the things that you may see in your employees that potentially could be related to experiencing violence at home? And then what is your opportunity to intervene? And it really, to us, it's twofold. The opportunity to intervene if somebody discloses. And so say, I'm so glad you told me what's going on. I'm happy to help. Let me give you some resources to try to help you navigate, what's going on. Or recognizing that here's some red flags that I maybe want to go to this employee and say, I noticed that there's some things going on. And I just like to talk to you about, do you feel safe at home? some of these things I've seen are alarming, and then hopefully creating an opportunity to have a conversation to best be able to support that employee. And so, ideally what we're hoping for is that survivors then have a safe place to get help, and Cocoon can come in and go down the journey of helping them get to safety, help them safety plan, help them mitigate risks that might be happening, but also giving the employer the tools to continue to support that employee that allows them to continue to be productive. So if the employee continues to be productive, the company continues to be able to be successful. And so how do we work together and hopefully make it, a process that is beneficial for both the employee, the employer, and then, us as the domestic violence agency coming in and providing support.
Give us some of those red flags that we need to be looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, one of the things that, we can see from individuals is, have they really been like a worker that really puts their heart and soul into what they're doing, right? They're hardworking. They're meeting their deadlines. They're doing all of the things that are expecting to them. And then all of a sudden we see this change, right? That we see that's not what's happening. They're missing deadlines. They're not as engaged in a meeting, or they're not engaged in a conversation. And very well that could be because they're really worried about what's going on at home, right? An employee who continues to start to call off more frequently, that is typical of them, or more frequently than what is really kind of allowed in a company, right? Like what is happening that this employee continues to call off frequently, hearing from employees about, excuses for things that just don't seem to make sense. Like the little radar goes up to say, well, that doesn't really seem like it makes sense. Employees who tend to, either be consistently late or, are like, got it, booking in out the door, kind of as quickly as their shift or their their roles and responsibilities end for the day. Those can be some things that we can see that are red flags. Even just sometimes the demeanor, right? Like having an employee who's coming in who just seems much more somber, seems distracted. The obvious things that we can look for, which is signs of physical abuse, right? Those kinds of things. And so really, creating an opportunity to have those kinds of conversations. One of the things that we talk about with HR managers and leaders in organizations is if you have an employee who's consistently coming in late, instead of just quickly going to, you're supposed to be here at 8:00, and when you don't come in at 8:00, it disrupts business, right? Like is to say, talk to me a little bit about like, what is the reason that you can't get here at 8:00 in the morning, right? Because it opens up the door to have the conversation. And if I have an abuser at home who knows I'm supposed to be at work at 8:00, that's a great time to pick a fight before I go out the door. That's a great time to hide the car keys and make me hunt around the house and look for them, right? Because ultimately an abuser's goal is to sabotage employment, because the more financially stable I am, the more resources I have to leave an abusive environment, right? But if I don't have the financial resources, so it opens up that conversation. And then to say, okay, now that I know this, what as an employer can I offer to you that we can meet in the middle, right? Like that, we're going to have a little bit more grace for some of these things, or we talk about like, how do we change schedules, right? If I don't have to work from 8 to 4 every day, if I have an abuser that I'm concerned about is going to be sitting in the parking lot or is going to sabotage my schedule, if my schedule is different every day, then it's really hard for that abuser to figure out what that is, right? So giving employers those tools to engage in the conversation and then problem solve that's within the limits of what, a company can offer, to still, again, make sure that business is getting done, but also we're supporting our employees.
Give me something that you've learned kind of on the business side. So on the Cocoon side, when you think about rolling this program out, getting the feedback, fine tuning it, and then obviously starting to scale this and open up the floodgates to, be able to help and equip more companies and more employees and individuals. What's something that you've learned in this process that, has been kind of like an aha moment, or something that's like, oh, this is something that I'm glad that we made this tweak and that, we can share it as words of encouragement for others that want to do something similar?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things that we've learned in this process. One is that it's really important for the process to be a partnership between the advocacy organization and the business or the organization that's asking for the support, because every organization and business is different. The way they function is different, and their culture is different, right? And so, we really start the conversation by saying, I'm so glad you're interested in, let's sit down and figure out what do you want to accomplish? Like, what's your end goal? And then how do we tailor our programming to meet that end goal? So that partnership is really important. I think the other thing is that sometimes employers are reluctant to engage in these kinds of conversations, or to start these kinds of programs because they don't want to send a message of, well, this is not a safe place to work, right? Or, we have a problem that now we have to go in and fix. It really is the opposite of that. It's about being proactive, which is why we call the program Champions of Change, right? We know if we go back to 1 in 4 women are experiencing domestic violence, that's 1 in 4 women that are in the workforce, right? Like, look at your employees and you know that 1 in 4 of them is experiencing domestic violence. It's already there. And so changing the narrative to say, we recognize that this could be something that our employees are experiencing, and we want to be proactive in creating these cultures that support individuals in our community, not the other way around, where we're identifying a problem that exists, that is maybe going to put us not in the most positive light, right? I think those are some things from just the beginning standpoint. The other thing that I think is really critical about this program and what we've learned and designed is that the conversations, once somebody signed on to be a champion of change, that the conversations and the trainings and the education start with the leadership and the HR folks. And so, most of the time what happens is that we, businesses get really excited and they're like, I want you to come in and I want you to talk to all my employees, and I want you to set up a table, and I want you to put up your signs, and I want you to do all of those things. And yes, we're going to do all of those things. But what I can promise you is that if we do that, immediately after we have that conversation, somebody's going to their supervisor, somebody's going to HR, and they're saying, I'm so glad that you brought those people in. I'm afraid to go home tonight. And you now have an HR person or a supervisor who is like, oh, I don't know what to say. I always call it like big eyes and no words, right? Like, so if we give the HR and the leadership the tools to say, when somebody discloses to you, here's some words to use, here's some language to use, here's some ways that you can start the conversation, then we've set up this whole process of everybody being able to create that safety net. And so those are the things that I think for us have been really important. I will also say, we've been really excited about the fact that PBE, who you mentioned earlier, that really the significance that it has made in their workplace culture from both we care about our employees standpoint, and we have created another opportunity for survivors in our community to get help, has really been pretty transformational, I think, for both the community and the businesses that have signed on to be champions of change.
What's really interesting is even going back to the conversation about your father and then business leaders not understanding the work that nonprofits do, or, we talk about the social good, the ripple impact for the Cocoon. You're literally stepping into businesses and showing them, here's exactly like how we can help, not only the employees, to help you as a business. And I think that's a really powerful underpinning. Carrying that into how this work has really transformed your lens for yourself, your ability to be a change maker, but also when you look at, your role as executive director for the Cocoon, how you can really create a ripple impact in the community. So how has this work transformed your view of yourself and obviously of social work?
Yeah. So excellent question. So if you'd have asked me probably even 10, 15 years ago, if I was going to be the executive director of an agency, I would have told you absolutely not. I am a social worker through and through. And so, it took me a long time, my journey, to get to the place that social work is what I needed. But everything that I do, even as the agency director, is from the lens of a social worker. And so it's people first all the time, right? So what do we do? People first. And then everything else to me then follows from that lens, if we think about it from that way. And so that's employees first, right? And then does it mean, and again, it's going back to this thing, right? At the end of the day, we have a business to run. And I appreciate what you were saying earlier. I think that people lose sight of the fact that nonprofits are businesses, right? At the end of the day, that's what we do. We just have a different lens of how we, how we carry out our services and our product into the community, right? So that doesn't mean that comes above all else, right? But if we start there, then we see the investment in the business and in the organization, which ultimately makes us successful. And so I think that really for me, I have been blessed for doing this work for over 20 years now. And every single survivor that I've met with has made an impact on me. And the honor that I feel that a survivor is willing to disclose to a stranger the most detrimental and probably darkest times in their lives that still comes to this day. And we didn't even, there's a whole nother conversation about this, right? That we still come to this day comes with a lot of stigma and shame. We as a country have not yet gotten to the place where we can say it's okay to talk about these things. We still pass judgment. There's still stigma about it. And so everything that I have had the honor and the privilege of learning and hearing from survivors, we then take that and put that back into the work that we do in the community. And I think that it has given me the opportunity to have a voice and a space at the table in our communities, in spaces that I never thought I would be, and that I never thought would be open to the conversation to say, as we're talking about economics in our county, we have to be talking about gender-based violence. As we're talking about housing opportunities in our county, we have to be talking about gender-based violence, right? And so that, the opportunity, when you talk about being change makers, the only way that we are going to eradicate violence in our communities, in particular interpersonal violence in our communities, is by social change. And we only make social change by bringing everybody together at the table to have the conversations and be open to moving the needle a little bit at a time. And that's what, and that to me is what these programs do. And that to me is what I feel like I have learned and been able to bring to the table, is that, we're in this together, but our lens of what people are experiencing in our community is just as important as all these other lenses of how we, again, create, strong, vibrant, safe communities for people in our neighborhoods, in our areas, right?
So obviously us opening these conversations and, being more mindful of organizations like the Cocoon, supporting the Cocoon. Talk about some words of encouragement for us to help be a part of preventing domestic and sexual violence, being a resource for survivors, being a safe place for the companies, to start taking those steps, just like Champions of Change, for all those around the nation. So share some words of encouragement, obviously for us supporting the Cocoon, but then in general, being change makers to help further this conversation and impact.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So, if you're in our area or our neck of the woods, and even if you are, we will take your support. And so all day, that if that's something that is important to you, it's something that you feel moved to do, we will definitely do that. I would say at the same time, learn who your local programs are in your area. Most areas have a domestic violence program, a rape crisis center that's working on the ground to support survivors in your community. So learn who those are. I will also say, learn where your deserts are. So, as an example, Ohio has 88 counties. We only have 76 domestic violence programs, right? So that every county in Ohio does not have a domestic violence program. It's going to be true in every state across our country. So learn where your resources are, learn where your resources aren't, to be part of that conversation about how do we bridge those gaps? How do we create those resources for people in our community that don't have easy access to them? But then recognizing that, we all can do something. And I think that is the thing that sometimes becomes a barrier to us, is that, it's not that we don't want to support survivors in our community. It's not that we don't want to be helpful. It's not that we don't want to intervene when we see something happening, but we don't know how. And there are so many different ways that you can be part of that change. Giving financially to those organizations that are in your area is a large way to make change, because it allows them to continue to do the work that they do. Our services that we provide at Cocoon are provided at absolutely no cost, no matter how little or how much survivors utilize our resources, because finances can be a barrier. That is true for probably most programs across the country. Volunteer your time. There are all kinds of ways that programs like ours can use support, from giving of time. So financially is not something you can do, but you have a talent, you have hours to give your time to those local organizations, and then be a connector. And when I say that, is sometimes it's about connecting the right people in the right place in the right room to make the conversations and to make the change, right? Sometimes it's about just opening the door to say, I'm a safe person. This is a safe place. If you need to talk about something, if you want to share something, I'm more than happy to listen. And then I can point you in the direction of getting you the help. You don't have to be the one to do the help, but you can be the one, again, to be the connector to get people to the help. And so creating opportunities to open those doors. Again, whether you're an employer, whether you're in a church, or some kind of other religious or spiritual organization, whether you're an educational institution, there's whether you're part of a service club, right? There are all these places where we can create the opportunity to say, let's have a conversation. I'm a safe person to be that connector. And then we always say, as part of our prevention program, if you see something, say something. And there's all kinds of ways that you can do that. There's a lot of information that you can find out about different ways that you can be, again, part of that solution. But there's always something that we can do. And so, really thinking about where you feel most aligned in supporting survivors. But most importantly, being that safe space for survivors to reach out and get the help that they need.
Great stuff. Extremely helpful. Let's switch over and do a lightning round as we wrap up. And so short questions, short answers. What do you like to do to relax?
Outdoors. I was just telling you today, we have an ice storm out there, so maybe not so much today, but anything outdoors. So I like to be out in the warmth of the sunshine.
You mentioned, the short breaks and the vacations and the trips. So what's a go-to spot for a favorite vacation spot outside of your area?
So we have a great park. It's called Dillon Park. That's kind of south of us, and it's a great weekend getaway. So you go, you can do a little bit of hiking, a little bit of barbecuing, and then come back to reality right after that. So yep.
You can name drop if you want for a restaurant, or it could be something you all make at home. But what's a favorite meal?
So we have the best Mexican restaurant, El Zarape. So Mexican, if you're Mexican is your thing, I have not found any better Mexican food than the one that's right across the street from me.
So when you talk about like a movie, a series, what do you like to watch on TV?
So interestingly, Fast and Furious is like my thing. If a groupie is such a thing, Fast and Furious is my thing. I love every single one of them. And I can't even wait for the next one to come out. So that's my thing.
Do you like the cars or just the storyline? Like, is it like I like to drive fast and like those sort of cars and races, or is it just like I love the movie and the cast?
It's both. So I love fast cars. I love like the, eighth of a mile, right? Like who's going to inch out the next one, right? Whether it's Fast and Furious or whether it's on the street, right? Street racing. I'm just I don't know. It's like sort of my adrenaline junkie kind of thing. But I love the storyline because the storyline is all about family, and family is who you make family, right? Family doesn't have to be who you are biologically related to. And the underpinning of all of those movies is about the importance of family and togetherness and helping each other. And so both.
When you have visitors come to the area, so putting on your tourism hat, outside of the Mexican restaurant, where else do you like to take them?
So yes, food. We have lots of food options. So that is one thing that we do in this area. And there are a lot of really cool county and city parks. And so that's a big thing that we'll do, that we'll take folks to go and visit those things as well. So we're very lucky because Toledo is just north of us. And so there's a lot of opportunities here. So yeah.
What's a fun date night for you and your husband?
Movie and dinner. And it doesn't matter. It can be any movie, any food, but just movie and dinner. And we're happy with that.
What's something that you've learned from your son?
Oh my gosh, so much. My son is the most special human ever. And I'm sure every mom says that, but I have the most special human. He is so intuitive. The most important thing that I think that I have learned from him is that the world is beautiful and you just have to look for it. And that there's good everywhere and in everybody. And I think that's the biggest lesson that he continues to teach me.
What's something you've learned from your husband?
I would say the biggest thing that I have learned from my husband is how to be the most supportive person to the people who matter the most. He is the first one who's going to pick up the phone if somebody needs help. He's the first one that's going to be there. He needs help. And I could not do what I do if he wasn't the most amazing, supportive human. And so I think that that lesson of, again, right? Like we can be there for people, and that's our first calling, right? Is that's the thing that's most important. So I think just the way he's just the most supportive.
And then you don't have to get the quote right, but what's a favorite quote or a saying? What's something that inspires you?
Absolutely. So I would think that probably the quote that I reach to the most is the quote that, that not everybody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And that it just takes one person to change the world.
That's awesome. It does. It takes one person to change the world. So obviously you're creating your legacy every single day, and you have many, many, many years to come. And, when you look at already the monumental change through the Cocoon and your efforts, extremely impressive how you power the good. But many, many years from now, what do you hope that people say about you and your legacy to make a difference?
I want people to know that survivors' stories matter, and that we did that we created a space where survivors' stories mattered, and that if you are in Wood County, Ohio, you know that this is a safe place to be, and that we've listened, and we've created opportunities for survivors to find their safety and healing.
We'll wrap up with where we can go to carry this conversation forward. So website for the Cocoon, social media, phone number, whatever you want to throw out there. How do we carry this conversation forward?
Yeah, so the best place to get all of our information is on our website, and that's just thecocoon.org. So super simple. We have information about our Champions of Change, all of the programs that we provide for survivors in the community, ways to support us is on our website. So that's your best opportunity to get information. If you have anybody that is interested in accessing services or learning more about how to get help, that would be our hotline number, and that's 419-373-1730. And then you select option 2, and that takes you to our 24/7 line. So that's the best way to connect to services.
Well, Kathy Mull, Executive Director of the Cocoon, you are indeed a change maker. So thank you for all you and your amazing team do to power the good. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services is proud to power the ChangeMakers podcast. We're a people-first company that protects what matters most, the families, businesses, and trailblazers that keep our community going. As one of the nation's top independent insurance firms, Higginbotham is a single-source solution for business insurance, employee benefits, HR services, and personal insurance that's customized for you. We're here to serve you, the people you care about, and your community. Call 866-377-1959 or visit higginbotham.com.
Thank you for listening to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by CityCURRENT and powered by Higginbotham Insurance and Financial Services.
To learn more, to listen to past episodes, and to share your stories of other changemakers who are making a difference, visit citycurrent.com or call 901-321-1020.
Follow the conversation online using the handle @CityCURRENT or the hashtag #PowerTheGood.